6 months after reversing upwards its growth forecast for Nigeria's economy in 2022 to 3.1% from its earlier projection of 2.7% released in January, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in their respective economic outlook report for Nigeria, revealed that rising inflation, pervasive insecurity, and fuel shortage will negatively affect the nation's economy. The country's economy has been projected to grow at a softer pace this year, as inflation will remain elevated, eating into consumers' pockets, pushing the poor and vulnerable households to live below the poverty line. In spite of the gloomy prediction of the economy, it is believed that the situation is redeemable if government can chart a pragmatic course for the economy by initiating policy reforms that will lift the economy out of the present stormy waters rather than pander to recommendations of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. But let's get talking. Joining me via Zoom again to look at this is an investment research analyst with United Capital PLC, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Tolu, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be on once again.
All right, there. Before we go into your projections or your prediction or United Capital's prediction, the World Bank today has come out again to say that fuel shortages and inflation and all of this will weaken Nigeria's economic growth. How does this come to you?
Yes, definitely. It's a significant concern. In terms of inflation, inflation figures for the month of May, for example, printed at a 6-month high, and by June we are likely going to be in a territory where inflation will be at multi-year highs. For example, for our projection, we're looking at inflation touching about 18.5% for June, and with that kind of rapid increase in aggregate price level, that is very concerning for consumers out there, because what that implies is income, as we know, income is not improving as much, although and a lot of consumers are basically facing higher prices in the marketplace, whereas income, on the other hand, is the growth in income is very much subdued when you compare to the rate of increase in prices. And what that does is it reduces your purchasing power as a consumer, and ultimately you buy lesser goods and services. So we definitely can understand where the World Bank and the IMF, where they are coming from in terms of higher inflation, higher prices would likely depress consumer pockets and subsequently also impact negatively on their purchasing powers and also impact on economic activities, because if consumers lower their demand, for context, the Nigerian aggregate economic activity is mainly controlled by consumers. Roughly about 60% of Nigeria's economic activities are controlled by consumers. So if a segment that contributes 60% of economic activity, if that segment is depressed in terms of purchasing power, then that would be a significant concern for economic growth. So that's definitely understandable why the IMF and World Bank are speaking from that perspective.
Great stuff. But despite all of these challenges, headwinds that we face, clearly we see it staring us in the face. You're out with an outlook that goal forecast is raised to about 2.9%. What are the fundamentals fueling this? Or what do you think will make us get to this before we wrap up this year?
Well, yes, definitely. So first, again, we have to look at the fact that growth in Q1 was very sharp. It was much faster than what was initially projected, across
3.1%, right?
Positive. Yes, 3.1% in Q1. So that automatically raises the scope for economic growth for the year. So that is when you're looking at 2022. So now, from our perspective, right, if you look at the forecast that we have a 2.9% forecast for the whole of 2022. So what you can automatically deduce from that is our growth expectations for the rest of the year, that is Q2, Q3, and Q4, will be lower than what we had in Q1, right? So for growth to moderate from 3.1 in Q1 to 2.9 for the whole year, then definitely growth expectations for the remaining 3 quarters in the year will likely be lower than what we had in Q1. So that the fact that we raised our GDP forecast was based on the fact that Q1 numbers in terms of economic growth performance was significantly better than what was anticipated. Now, when we look at in terms of the key sectors, right, because the way we look at it, we like to look at it from breaking it into 4 key categories. First is the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector would likely face a bit of pressure in Q2 and Q3, largely because we are not going to be in the harvest season, and a lot of agricultural activities would be around planting rather than harvesting. We would resume harvest season more or less towards the end of Q3, going into Q4, and then the festive period demand, which is when we expect the agricultural sector to see a bit of recovery compared to Q2 and Q3. So on that front, we're expecting the fact that strong food demand, because the truth is, no matter how poor Nigerians get, no matter the level of poverty, and more and more people going below the poverty line, if there's one critical thing that consumers will spend money on, it's going to be food. And that is one major positive for the agricultural sector. And that is why the agricultural sector is sort of a perpetually growing segment of the market, because as the population of the country increases, then the demand for food would also continue to increase. And we have those projections. Now, that's not to say that there are no downside risks for the agricultural sector. Today, insecurity in key food producing states across the country remains a concern, because that has depleted farming population a lot. A lot of farmers are no longer going to their farms because of the banditry, insecurity, and all the terrorism activities going on, kidnapping and all, in some of the key food producing states. So we have seen the fact that a lot of farmers are no longer going to the farms, and that is likely going to put a dent on food outputs. Also, there are also challenges from inputs. As we know today, price of fertilizers are at record highs, because because of the looking at some of the impacts of the Russian-Ukraine crisis on the supply dynamics for fertilizers, and also the impact on the price of grains and other key inputs that we use in our planting process. So those are key things that are likely going to impact on the agricultural sector's growth. But nevertheless, despite these challenges, the underlying demand for food is likely going to outweigh those challenges in the agricultural sector, and we project a growth in that front. Next is the services sector. The services sector has been the key driver of economic growth in Nigeria, and it's been largely down to the telecom sector, the trade sector, and the financial services sector. Now, going forward for us, we think the telecom sector will still continue to do well, largely because voice traffic and data traffic has been growing consistently as internet penetration, broadband penetration, and smartphone penetration continues to increase. And even we now have most of the network providers, telecom providers, are now able to register new SIM users, which is going to be positive also for the sector. So we expect the telecom sector to remain quite strong. For the financial services sector, we expect loan creation to remain pretty steady, because a lot of banks definitely have to do at their best to comply with the CBN's minimum loan to deposit ratio. So as much as possible, they have to continue to extend credit in order to ensure they stay within that threshold required by the CBN. And then we also include the activities of other financial institutions, microfinance banks, and the presence of, credit lending from, we have lots of other financial institutions playing in the microcredit space now, and that is giving a significant boost also to the financial services sector. So we also expect those two key sectors, financial services and telecoms, to be key drivers of economic growth for the rest of the year, particularly in the services space. Now, the last sector we expect to also do very well is the manufacturing sector, which is largely going to be driven by consumer demand. We've seen that, following the close of the pandemic last year, following the reopening of the economy, a lot of businesses were not really sure of hiring to full capacity, going back to full capacity production. But so far this year, we have seen, towards the end of last year down into this year, we have seen improved confidence from business and factory owners, such that they have returned back to full capacity. They are now operating most of their plants at full capacity. They've employed more labor, and they are now willing to sort of produce more. That is one key positive for the manufacturing sector. Then the fact that they are able to now hire more workers, and they are also able to increase wages back to where they were before the pandemic is also providing a boost for consumer demand, which, what that does is it improves consumer demand and then also improves supply, because as demand rises, manufacturers will try to catch up with the supply. Now, that said, the manufacturing sector has its own challenges in terms of FX liquidity and then the supply chain disruption challenges that we have been facing. Although we have seen that ease a bit, but with the surge in the price of diesel, which is affecting cost of logistics, lack of availability of FX, which is affecting ability to import key raw materials. Those are two key things that remain they remain some sort of bottlenecks in terms of the supply chain dynamics for the manufacturing sector. But nevertheless, we still expect sectors like cement, construction, chemicals, food, beverage, and tobacco, those key sectors will likely perform very well. The only sector we are not very positive about is the oil sector, which is largely down to the fact that we are still struggling with oil theft and vandalism, which is impacting on our crude oil production. So bearing the oil sector, all the other key sectors, particularly the non-oil sector, are poised to deliver strong output growth this year, which is where we looked at our forecast and we said, we should see the Nigerian economy at least expand by 2.9% this year. So that's where those are the key factors driving our assumptions.
Brilliant. Well detailed. There, you actually flipped into my next question, because I was wondering that with all of these challenges, the manufacturing space, I worry a lot. Projections of 350 naira for a liter of diesel, and today is about 800 naira in some cases. But let's wrap up this discussion on this note. A lot of support for the agricultural space, both local and international. So that's also something that I'm thinking that, are we going to get all of the positives of this, looking at the figures that we'll get at the end of the year? And also, the oil sector, which you identified, I think issues around vandalism and oil theft is also hitting us so badly.
Yes, so for the agricultural sector, we think that, yes, a lot of funding has come in over the past, say, from the AFDB, the World Bank, trying to provide support for vulnerable countries and to enable, to sort of boost food production, such that by the time we get towards the harvest season, there won't be so much scarcity and food supply would still be pretty decent. But the concern for us is how it's going to be around the mechanism with which these funds are disbursed. Like, for Nigeria, for example, we've had years, since 2015, we have had the Anchors Bora program, we've had the Commercial Agricultural Credit Scheme, and all these programs that they've not yielded significant benefits, right, for the agricultural sector. Agricultural sector growth is still very much below pre-2015 era. So the concern for us is, how will these funds be disbursed? If these funds are disbursed properly, then the timing for the disbursement, was very, very good, because basically those funds were coming in basically around the start of the planting season. So it will enable the farmers to be able to procure fertilizers, procure farm equipment, procure inputs and seeds that they need for planting as the planting season started. But the concern is, these funds, are they going to go into the right hands, and will they be used properly? If those two conditions are met, then we can expect to reap some of the benefits in the agricultural sector this year. If otherwise, the story is going to be different. Then finally, on the oil sector, the concern definitely still remains. It looks like there's not so much that is being done about that now. And what we are even basically saying is, a lot of the IOCs, those are the international oil companies, are sort of just closing down on production within Nigeria, trying to divest from their assets to sell to local oil companies who are willing to take up those assets, because there's not so much value from them. And if you analyze the capital expenditure of a lot of the IOCs relative to the amount of dividend they are declaring, relative to the amount of cash flow they are pulling out of production, you would see the significant cause for alarm, because capital expenditure, which you would expect to be invested in terms of developing the oil infrastructure for most of these IOCs. They have basically cut down their capex expenditure because they are no longer seeing the need for them to sort of invest aggressively in these assets, because they invest in them, these assets get vandalized, oil theft along the way, insecurity issues, and the authorities are not doing so much to provide them that assurance that these issues will be curbed. So as long as we continue to have these issues, we will continue to see capital expenditure and investments in our oil infrastructure continue to dwindle. And as a result, that will continue to create pressure on our oil outputs and subsequently oil GDP. In fact, we expect the oil sector this year to contract by as much as about close to 20% this year, which is something that is quite drastic. But fortunately, the oil sector is just about 6 or 7% of the total economy. So that is why we might not necessarily feel the impact as much.
Amos, thank you so much for your time. Investment research analyst at United Capital PLC there, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Thank you so much and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me, Tolo. Always a pleasure.